Hello and welcome. Well, we always knew that we were moving towards an authoritarian left-wing state, but the speed with which it's developing its authoritarian credentials has taken many of us by surprise. And yet, traditional Catholics found themselves targeted by the FBI last year in the United States. In August 2023, the Catholic Herald reported, for example, that leaks had revealed the FBI were focused in particular on Catholics who were interested in the traditional Latin Mass, as the group within the Church allegedly the most likely to be sympathetic to violent extremist activities. You have to laugh. What begins in America often swiftly finds its way into the UK, but how swiftly? In our case, the Home Secretary has recently commissioned a swift review of what have been described as extremist ideologies as part of a new government anti-extremist strategy. Well, we live in a world of new politically charged euphemisms, and as so often, extremist has come to mean views that the authoritarian left-wing government disapproves of and is threatened by. So she's vowed to crack down hard on people whom she considers to be pushing, quote, harmful or hateful beliefs. Now, the problem, of course, as we all know, and the threat lie in the definition of what constitutes harm and hate. In the left's new lexicon, anything that counters the authoritarian dogma of progressivism, the platform on which they've built their project, is of course harmful and hateful. Brendan O'Neill sounded the alarm recently on behalf of Catholics when he wrote in the London Spectator, "Indeed, I can envision entire belief systems being reimagined as harmful. Some already have been so. Traditional Catholics, for example. They think marriage should only be between a man and a woman, that sex is determined by God, not scalpel-wielding gender surgeons, and that only followers of Christ go to heaven. That's homophobic, transphobic, and Islamophobic, right? In other words, harmful. Shut them down." One of the consequences of secular opprobrium is that it has the effect of placing a lot of pressure on us as Catholics to dilute our Catholicism, the faith of the Church, in order to be thought better of than others, in order to fit in better under the pressure of groupthink. But this is, of course, a form of ideological Danegeld. The more one gives away in order to placate one's enemies, the more they demand. You remember the way in which the early English tried to buy off the Viking invaders, failing hopelessly. Instead, of course, it might be better to consider the contents of the beliefs and why we hold them. In his influential book, Varieties of Religious Experience, the psychologist William James, an agnostic for those of you who don't know him, he suggested that the claims of special religious experience can be stress tested by means of assessing the effect they have on the moral behaviour of those who experience them or follow them. Since the authoritarian government is using the contemporary language of heresy in order to socially excommunicate or even lock up heretics, and the currency of this heresy is so-called hatred, by which of course they actually really mean a repudiation of their own political philosophy and values, we might suggest looking at the moral effects of our value systems, which understandably have been placed under the spotlight. So why does the Catholic Church see marriage in terms of two heterosexuals coming together with the effect of producing children? Is this really a deeply rooted fear of the other? Well, firstly, of course, by revelation, because that's what Christ told us. But also because without children there is no society. Because the pyramid of relations of mutuality that flow from grandparents through parents to their children and their children's children is a structure out of which a stable society grows and glues itself together, a generative hierarchical society with multiple skills and resources flourish. Perhaps one reason why the left doesn't like heterosexual marriage and dismisses its proponents as hateful is because, of course, the family acts in competition to the state, or rather, the state has got ambitions to replace the family. A society made up of extended families is less reliant on the state, and we've noticed the way in which the state seeks to make most of the people as reliant on it as possible. Authoritarian governments of the left always target the heterosexual family and the church as the competition they fear most. It's not phobic to recognise that changing the definition of marriage changes our capacity to build and enable society, and also the kind of society that we have. Whatever the individual and moral virtues of individual same-sex attracted couples, the redefinition of marriage to include homosexuality changes what marriage is. It writes biological sterility into the marriage project. And it changes the model of marriage from one that is outward-looking to one that's inward-looking, harnessing sexual desire for recreation instead of taming it for procreation. Mutual pleasuring becomes a higher value than the self-giving of parenthood. Self-sacrifice, the kind that is required only by parenthood, is replaced by an aspiration for self-fulfillment, with all the solipsistic implications that such a shift involves, particularly when it's focused on the romantic and the erotic exclusively. And in the marketplace of surrogate motherhood, the horror that children become demoted to be commodities, whose rights to have access to their biological parents are denied forever by this commodity-driven adoption system. Transphobia is yet another attempt to replace moral discrimination with fake therapeutic terms. The normalizing of gender dysphoria is not about bestowing a gift of alternative becoming on our children. It's the abandonment of adult responsibility and facilitating the permanent surgical sterilization of an adolescent, it's often adolescents, whose mind is at war with the biology of their body. Adults ought to know that the mind changes. Much worse, it's the preferencing of the unstable imagination over biological reality, the relative over the unforgiving absolute. It's played its part in creating a dreadful climate of uncertainty and threatening anxiety amongst our children that is expressed in never before seen levels of depression, uncertainty and angst. The adoption of trans rights and identities even fails the Benthamite test of maximised social happiness. Trans regrets running publicly at over 30% at the moment, but in reality, of course, much more. Before we get to the abdication of medical, psychological and parental responsibility towards our troubled children. So where does the hate really lie? True caring takes responsibility for protecting our children, for protecting the troubled and the anxious. Liberty and unrestrained license is in fact the abandonment of care. Actually, it's a kind of passive-aggressive hate. The hate really lies on the other side of the progressive line. And believing that only Catholics go to heaven is a superficial misrepresentation of our Catholic faith. Only God knows the secrets of our hearts and our choices. But since the sacrifice of the incarnate Christ on the cross offers every single being unlimited forgiveness before God, why repudiate Jesus and choose instead Mohammed? What's the advantage of preferencing a warlord who kills his enemies over a saviour who changes his enemies into friends, and instead of killing people, raises them from the dead? Why preference a prophet who insists on submission over a saviour who offers forgiveness? Why orientates towards the unknowable and implacable Allah when Jesus introduces you to the existential intimacy of the Father, the great I am that I am, Yahweh? They are two different, almost opposite kinds of divinity, and it is an abdication of truth and reality and integrity to mask choice as phobia. By all means let there be choice, but to work against the possibility of informed choice, which is evangelization, in order to produce a fake phobia, that's the real extremism. In other words, it's the government that's being hateful. It's the government that's being extremist. The deceit of a government criminalizing choice, conscience, virtuous outcomes, potential transformation of individuals and communities as extremist hate, tells us more about the amorality and insincerity of the political project that we've been captured by after this last election, the authoritarianism of the progressive left, than ever it does about the integrity of Catholics and the Catholic faith. So, far from accepting criminalization, relativism, and the rhetoric of a different kind of political absolutism, Catholics should do what until today we've always had a right to do, to take the facts and the arguments to the public square and defy the threat and intimidation that lies behind describing us as hateful extremists. Let us tell the truth about our priorities, about our moral choices, about our experiences of the living God, about our values, because, as we know only too well, as Jesus taught us, the truth will set us free. And that is exactly what a controlling authoritarian government appears to be afraid of.